Oh, time for parasomnias.
Sleepwalkers have been depicted as zombie-like beings who stumble through the night, eyes glazed over and arms outstretched. Though in reality behaviors aren't generally that odd, there are some unusual facets to the sleep disorder. Here are 10 weird facts about sleepwalking. Number 10. Treks aren't necessarily local. Sure, a lot don't make it past their living rooms, but from time to time, people really go the distance. Last fall, a Colorado woman was found 9 miles from her home. Number 9. It can bring out one's inner artist. Just ask Lee Hadwin of North Wales. He spends his days as a nurse with no particular interest in art, but while in a sleepwalking state, creates accomplished drawings. He says he has no training in the medium and has no idea where this skill comes from. Number 8. Episodes occurring during the REM cycle can signal serious health issues. Sleepwalking-type behaviors most often occur during the non-rapid eye movement. When they present during the dream state, they're classified as a REM behavior disorder and can be an early sign of Lewy body dementia or Parkinson's disease. Number 7. Some people temporarily gain superpowers. An 18-year-old not only jumped from her 25-foot-high window while sleeping, she did so without sustaining any injuries. Number 6. Waking a sleepwalker isn't always a bad thing. Contrary to popular belief, heart attacks and comas are not consequences of forcing a sleepwalking person into full consciousness. In fact, if they're about to put themselves in a perilous situation, it may be the best route. That said, gently guiding them back to bed is preferable. Number 5. Don't be surprised if an abruptly awoken sleepwalker punches you. If a person is jostled from sleep while in an unexpected environment, there's a chance they'll be afraid, confused, and lash out. Number 4. Working while sleepwalking is not unheard of. A chef was known to head to the kitchen and whip up some food, and another man took advantage of an extra moments of mobility to mow the lawn. Number 3. Inexplicably tight pants may be a sign you're doing it. A woman in the UK watched her calorie intake and exercised regularly, but put on dozens of pounds regardless. Number 2. While some sleepwalkers talk, others prefer to email. An Ohio woman did indeed sleepwalk to her computer, log in, and start typing. Though the email she sent mostly made no sense, one of the messages included a request that the recipient drop by with some wine and caviar. Number 1. Sleepwalking is most common in children. According to a study performed by the Stanford University Sleep Epidemiology Research Center, up to 30% of children have experienced the disorder. Typically, the behavior disappears by adulthood.
So again, what counts as a parasomnia is anything that produces behavior or sensation, any weird experience you have associated with sleep. Now what we're looking at here in this section, we're in the sleep disorders section. So these are parasomnias that enter the realm of disorder. A lot of parasomnias do not. So let's hit, first off, some that are considered normal and typical, that may or may not enter the realm of disorder depending on how much they bother you and how frequent they are, and if they get in the way of normal sleep. In the introduction section, we talked about hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations. Hypnagogic are hallucinations you will have just as you're falling asleep, and hypnopompic are ones you'll have just as you're waking up, because there is still a sliver of conscious awareness there, but your brain is still dreaming. So you are having conscious perception of dream imagery or sound. So the most common, if we go hypnagogic, the ones that happen as you're falling asleep, you'll start to be drifting off, you'll hear a knock at the door, the phone ring, someone whisper your name or someone shout your name, or you'll hear a scream or some other sound and it'll jerk you awake. Or you'll have a sudden sensation that you're falling that will jerk you awake, or that you're floating. Any of those can happen. The key is they kind of jerk you awake. because you have a moment of conscious awareness still in there, and this weird sensation pops you into wakefulness. Those are normal, they're frequent. The auditory ones are fascinating because the sound is so real. You're sure it was really there. That's the power of the auditory cortex. Basically, your perception of sound in the environment is only partially due to that sound energy hitting your ears. Your conscious awareness of it are the neurons in your auditory cortex firing off and delivering to you a conscious perception of the sound. That can do it on its own if it's left to play with no internal stimulus. That's how you hear things in dreams. The occipital lobe, your visual cortex, the same way. It's taking signals from the eyes and processing it, but when you're asleep and your eyes are closed and no information is coming from them, those same processing areas get to run and play and produce whatever visuals they want. That's why we mentioned earlier, if I take out your visual cortex, even though your eyes are still fine, they're still functional, they're still delivering signal, but there's no cortex here to process it, you are functionally blind. You will see nothing. In fact, because the cortex is gone, and this is the key to visualization, you will not dream in vision anymore either. You cannot even imagine a visual scene. You would have no visual memory left after that. So the hypnopompic hallucinations that happen as you wake up, you may wake up and still feel a dream element or see something in the room or hear something going on. You can also have distortions, not only hearing things that aren't there, but you may not hear something that is there. You may wake up and you know there's a sound, but you can't identify it or clearly hear it. And you have to be awake for a little bit, a few seconds, before you realize that's the alarm clock, or that's my phone ringing, or that's the doorbell. It's not pinning down what the sound is at that point. So all of these things can occur there. If you've ever been in a noisy environment and started to fall asleep in a noisy environment, you could actually have a moment where your auditory cortex stops processing sound, and all of a sudden everything is silent, and that pops you awake, and then you hear the sound again. So any of these things can happen. They are normal. There's nothing wrong with you if you have these things occurring. Hypnopompic hallucinations, because they're usually associated with REM sleep, also tend to be associated with sleep paralysis. As we mentioned earlier, the pons, which has been interrupting motor signals, because in REM, unlike other sleep stages, your brain is sending signals to the body to run or jump or whatever you're doing in your dream. The pons is interrupting them, so you're technically, functionally paralyzed. If you're experiencing a dream element as you regain consciousness, you're likely also still partially paralyzed as you regain consciousness. Now that's different from waking up and your arm is numb because you were laying on it and it takes a while to flop it around to get it feeling something. That's not sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is when you literally can't move, and that itself can be startling. So here's a laundry list of the parasomnias we're going to look at. As you can see, there's a division between non-REM disorders and REM disorders. That simply means what stages of sleep these occur in. So the non-rapid eye movement sleep arousal disorders, NREM, means they happen in stages 1, 2, or 3. And the rapid eye movement disorder happens in REM. So that's all that those mean. So it's in the non-REM that we hit, here's the two that are on here, sleepwalking and sleep terrors, which are often called night terrors. So let's look at that. Now I do need to address here at the beginning, there are some who feel sleepwalking may not actually be a full sleep state. It may be more of an amnesic state where you are getting up and moving around, but you're going to have no memory. There's no memory consolidation process going on, so you won't remember it later. Because some sleepwalking is very detail oriented. In fact, let's take a look at some issues on sleepwalking and especially nocturnal eating.
For the next 4 nights, we monitor what June gets up to in her sleep. And the answer is nothing. We're beginning to wonder whether our cameras have cured her. But then, on night 6, June falls asleep with the light on. It's 4:30. She gets up and heads straight for the fridge. June starts preparing a feast. There's quiche, chicken and rice, leftovers from last night's meal. It's hard to believe that she's actually asleep.
Nocturnal sleep-related eating disorder may be analogous to sleepwalking. In sleepwalking, patients go into deep sleep, and then for some peculiar reason they get up and walk around, and they can carry out some quite complicated actions during sleep. They may walk out the front door, they may go up and down stairs, or they may hoover the fridge out.
Here is the hard evidence of nocturnal sleep-related eating disorder.
This is not put on, this is not an excuse for night eating. The patient is actually asleep.
June takes the food back to bed with her and spends another 10 minutes finishing the plateful.
Tried everything to stop eating my sleep. I've tried not to have any perishable foods in the house, but that still doesn't work, because if I've got something like pasta, I'll get up and cook that.
A simple padlock could be the answer, but her friends have tried something similar already.
They were aware of my night eats, so I told them about it. So they thought, well, one way around it was to actually, you know, sellotape the fridge, which they did. Like great big bounds of brown sellotape, but that didn't last very long. I ripped it off by the next night.
We keep the cameras rolling, and on 2 consecutive nights, she eats again. On both occasions, she actually heats up the food in the microwave, which is just out of vision.
I've been to see my GP about it twice, but they've always just been dismissive about it. Basically, I think they don't know about it themselves. I went to Overeaters Anonymous to try and get some answers to this eating disorder, but nobody had no idea about it or hadn't even heard of it. What I really do want is to like speak to somebody about getting a cure for it.
We don't know yet how to treat this condition, and a lot more work needs to be done on it. There are some treatments that are used to treat other sleep-related disorders like sleepwalking. The trouble is many of these medications are addictive potentially and habit-forming, and so one wouldn't want to use them for any length of time.
June's been struggling with this disorder for 10 years, but until now, she had no idea what she got up to. So we invited her to view the footage. This is the first time she's seen herself sleep eating.
I just really don't know what to say, because I'm watching it, I'm seeing it, but it just doesn't seem for real. And the fact that I can't remember, I'm trying to sit here thinking, you know, you must remember, you must have remembered.
What would you say to people that would think that you were awake?
I'm telling you, I'm not awake. Number one, I wouldn't be caught on camera looking like that anyway. It just doesn't seem normal. It's how can somebody do all that when they're asleep? It's quite embarrassing to watch, actually. Well, it's strange, because, I mean, when I've always talked about it in the past, I've always laughed about it, but actually seeing it, it's not really a laughing matter. Sorry, thanks.
June was too upset to carry on looking at the footage. And she's still dieting by day and binging unconsciously by night.
You okay? Where you going, honey? You okay? Okay. Wanna go to bed? Huh? You tired? Wanna go to bed?
Yeah, now is it dangerous to wake a sleepwalker? There's no evidence for that. It's just very hard, because if I'm a nocturnal eating sleepwalker and I'm sitting there in the kitchen putting stuff in the microwave and preparing food, and that's not waking me up, then you saying, hey, wake up, hey, wake up, that's probably not going to do it either. So, and again, that's why some people think it's not so much a sleep state, it's a state of amnesia where I'm not processing any new memory. If you took general psych, this is what we would call anterograde amnesia, where you are somewhat aware in the moment, but once that moment is over, no memory for it has processed. And that can be a very startling thing for people who think someone else, like if you have a roommate and you think the roommate is getting up in the night and eating your food or whatever, and then put a video out to catch them and see you come out there. A lot of people think, that can be funny to watch it if it's someone else. But if it's you, that can be very scary to think, I can get up and do something that complex and have no memory of it later. What else can I possibly do there? In the majority of sleepwalking cases, the person, as it mentions on the slide, has a very just blank expression, almost a zombie-like, out of it zoning expression. They don't necessarily respond to you too much, but they are responding to the environment, meaning they're not just going to walk right into a wall as if it's not there. They will navigate objects in the environment. They may be partially, when we say relatively unresponsive, like say it's a child that just came wandering into the living room, and you'll say, do you want some water? Yeah. And when you bring them water, they won't do anything with it. They've essentially already forgotten they even asked. And then later, they may not remember any of it. There could be points where you do remember pieces of it, and that's what lends support to the idea that it's an amnesic state more than a sleep state. Let's go on to another side, something we talked about in the physiology of sleep. Is it a unihemispheric sleep state, where the majority of your brain is asleep, but enough of it is awake that you have motor control and can navigate the environment, but you're not processing everything? And one of the things you're not processing is memory, as far as that goes. So sleepwalking does seem to have a genetic component to it. And the reason we say that is we find it runs in families. And twins, identical twins, tend to have a higher rate of it together than other siblings. So could be a genetic component that leads to that. Sleep terrors or night terrors are when you will wake up suddenly screaming, terrified. You're very non-responsive to the environment. You're really hard to settle down. And the next day you won't remember any of it. Let's look at a couple examples of sleep terrors.
This young man suffers from what are called night terrors. These night terrors can produce disturbed and frightened behavior even under test conditions.
What you're seeing here is Jackson having a night terror. It's not a nightmare, but a night terror. You'll have to look up a little bit. But he does this almost every night, and he'll call out my name, and sometimes he'll answer me, but 9 times out of 10, he's just screaming and crying, extremely sweaty, his heart's racing and everything. And I kind of wanted to show you what a night terror is. We have to sit with Jackson during his night terrors because at times he hit himself. He has fallen off the bed, hit his head before. He hits himself in the head. He'll hit other people too, but it's important that we are there with him. And as you can see, he'll get up and jump around. And it's just not safe for him to be having a night terror by himself. With Jackson, he usually has what I would call a transition point. It's where he's not quite awake and he's not quite in the full-blown night terror yet. With him, it's not the same with all kids, but with him, he has to fully awake before he can return to a restful sleep. So this is kind of his transition period. You want to see the shapes?
Yeah, now in some cases, what seems to be going on here, it seems like the person woke from a nightmare but cannot remember the nightmare. We got to go into the limbic system here for a moment. The amygdala, little almond-sized things on either side that are the key to strong emotion. If I could just plug little electrodes into your amygdala right now and turn it up and activate them, it will cause a massive exaggeration of whatever emotion you're feeling right now. A lot of people will say the amygdala specializes in negative emotion, and that's not entirely true. The amygdala is kind of like an amplifier. Whatever emotion you're feeling, whether it's good or bad, the amygdala elevates it. It also has some association with pain perception. The moment a stimulus reaches the point that we would say ouch is when the amygdala fires off. So the reason I bring that up is in the issue of night terrors. One of the theories is that your amygdala has fired off. You're not actually having a nightmare, but the firing of the amygdala causes a terror response, kind of an unfocused terror response that forces you into wakefulness. And that's why you have trouble remembering it. Again, not only are these more in non-REM states, but they tend to happen most frequently in the deeper stage 3 parts of it. Some of this is related to the effects you can get from sleep aids. And we'll mention at the end of this one something called Ambien fugue, in which people actually get up, move around, and do some very complex things when they've taken sleep medications. It's not just Ambien, but Ambien's the one that got tagged with it. Some key here, as this one reports, little or no dream imagery is recalled, usually not. You don't remember any of it. This is usually in the first part of your major sleep episode, the first part of the night. Because again, if this is a deeper stage sleep event, it's the first part of the night you're spending the most time in those deeper stage areas. REM, most of your REM is in the second half of the night, so we'll see the REM disorders are more likely to happen in that part of the night. Again, can occur in any stage, but it tends to be the deeper ones. So we already saw here sleepwalking, nocturnal eating, sleep-related sexual behavior, sexsomnia. That is where you will engage in sexual behavior. If you have a partner and you share a bed, you may very absently and in an amnesic way just start engaging in sexual behavior with them, and sometimes very high aroused sexual behavior. So the behavior can sometimes be different than what it would be in a normal waking state. We're going to see the same thing when we talk about the sleep aids, and Ambien has that same effect to it. And it's probably that the sleep aids are essentially producing kind of a sleepwalking effect. Okay, that brings us to nightmare disorder. Nightmares. Yeah. Ooh. We're going to hit this more, nightmares in general, in its own section. So nightmares by themselves do not represent a disorder. We all have them sometimes. Nightmare disorder is when you're having nightmares frequently. They wake you up feeling very uncomfortable. So again, I don't have it on here, but we're doing the at least 3 nights a week for at least 3 months going on. Nightmare disorder can be an early sign of post-traumatic stress disorder as well. It can be a hint of that, especially depending on the content of the nightmares. If your trauma experience is dominating the content of these nightmares, we're definitely in PTSD country there. So again, extended, when we say extremely dysphoric, that means very emotionally unpleasant, and you remember them very well. And of course, the whole thing of a nightmare is that there's some direct threat to you or someone else, or you're trying to avoid something. Again, anything negative in here. Usually, in this case, occurring during the second half of the evening, because nightmares, although they can happen in any stage, they are most likely to happen during REM. Now let's bring up something we will bring up again in our formal section on nightmares. What makes a nightmare have the feeling it does? That's going to be the amygdala again. I could have a dream that I am the only one left in my town. There's no one else anywhere. It's just me and I'm by myself. If my amygdala starts firing off, I'm going to find that a terrifying event. I'm going to label it as a nightmare. If my amygdala is not firing off, I may think it's cool. Wow, I can go anywhere. I can do anything. I can go into any building I want. This is kind of neat and mystical and cool. I may enjoy it. So it's not always the content of the dream that defines whether something is a nightmare. It's often whether the amygdala is firing off with it that determines if it's a nightmare. So again, if you have these repeatedly, weekly, for an extended period of time, you're getting into disorder. If you just have nightmares now and then, that's not considered a disorder. If you're a student, you may find you have nightmares about school just before school starts, that, oh, I forgot which class I was in, couldn't find my room, showed up to class and I had no pants on, whatever it is. One you may think is really, well, we won't get into that. We'll save that one for later. Some of the common nightmares that people don't want to talk about because they think they're weird turned out to be really common nightmares. Yeah, any of that can go on. Let's go to REM sleep behavior disorder. Now, this is different than sleepwalking. It's different from talking in your sleep or sometimes just moving around a little bit. That usually happens in non-REM sleep. I may just move a little bit or talk. That's non-REM. If it's happening in REM sleep, that's a little more serious because, again, the pons is shutting off, or is supposed to be shutting off, motor function to the body during REM. If I'm sleepwalking, I'm going around, as we mentioned, and I navigate the environment. I will go through doorways, I'll walk around furniture. I am obviously visually processing the environment when I'm sleepwalking. If you get up and move in REM sleep disorder, often your eyes are closed. And even if they're open, you're not responding very well at all to the environment. You're responding to what's going on in your dream. So you may very well just jump up and run right into the wall or something else because you're responding to that internal environment, not the external environment. So again, normal REM, you're paralyzed. You can't do anything. And that's why REM sleep disorder, when you actually start moving in REM, as the last bullet on here says, is quite often an early sign of a neurodegenerative disorder. We see it frequently in people who will later be diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And the getting up and running into a wall, I'm kind of going backward through the slides here, through the bullets, but that is a dream enacting behavior, meaning I'm not responding to the environment, I'm responding to what's going on in my dream. Quite often, you are frightened or angry, and you may lash out at people in the environment. So that can be, for some people, very dangerous. Again, so it's not the same as your normal sleep talking or moving during sleep. Now, there's a little bit of difference. Don't run to the bank 100% on this when it comes to the sleep talking. Some people will mumble during their sleep. Sometimes you can tell very clearly what they're saying. But other times it's just, it's sunrise time. And it's just, there's bits and pieces, but you can't tell exactly what they're saying. It's in REM sleep, sleep talking, you're most likely to talk in anger or to shout profanities, something like that. That can happen in other stages, but it is more likely in the REM sleep stage that you're going to do that. So again, you're going to engage in complex motor behavior, more likely to have complex speech. Most of the time your eyes will be closed, but you'll look like you're awake. Because again, in REM, your brain is just about as active as it is when you're awake. So that can be an issue. Take a brief look here at REM sleep disorder.
David Moorhead would kick in his sleep while he was dreaming.
Both legs, both feet, as hard as I could kick. Because most of the time I was fighting with someone, or it was anger.
This was a symptom of a sleep problem, REM sleep behavior disorder.
REM sleep behavior disorder, patients abnormally will move and they'll act out dreams. So a common complaint people have is that they're kicking or punching or fighting.
It can be quite serious.
I have seen patients who will punch through the wall at night and end up with broken bones. I have seen patients who have hit their spouse and caused physical harm, not anything on purpose, but it's just a manifestation of the disorder.
I sat up on my knees in bed and punched the wall at the head of the bed as hard as I could in the midst of a deep dream. And I do remember that because my hand hurt. I landed right here on this tile floor, out of bed, diving for a football in a fumble in a football game.
It can also be seen with other sleep disorders.
David, for example, also has sleep apnea, a problem where he stops breathing while asleep. He was also evaluated for restless leg syndrome, which occurs during non-REM sleep, just like sleepwalking and sleep talking.
Those are what we call non-REM parasomnias.
A sleep study can show a person being active during REM sleep. Luckily, the disorder responds well to treatment, such as a sedative called clonazepam, or high-dose melatonin, a sleep hormone. Also, bedroom safety is part of the treatment plan, moving the bed away from the window and moving lamps and other objects away from the bed. With medication, David is doing better.
I don't have as much movement and as much action.
Yeah, that brings us to restless leg syndrome, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, is something that wasn't there in the DSM-4. It's been studied over time. A lot of people were quite suspicious of it, that it was a real thing. There was an argument that it was just the pharmaceutical industry grabbing whatever they could so they could sell you medications for it. Research has supported the subjective experience of this as a real thing. And it's not just an urge to move the legs. If you experience this, you may define the sensation in different ways, but it's a general discomfort in the legs. This feeling like almost like there's energy running through them that is distracting, that you can feel them, almost like you can feel the nerves in your legs tingling or vibrating, and moving them seems to be the only way to alleviate that. The problem is that motion then elevates heart rate, respiration. The sensation causes you discomfort or anxiety, so that interrupts sleep. And the sensation may be relieved when you initially move the legs, but after a while it starts coming back. Also, it can occur during sleep and wake you up. So a lot of restless leg syndrome cases before we had this diagnosis got labeled as insomnia because people would wake up frequently and have trouble getting back to sleep. When it comes to a new syndrome being labeled, what happens is, and when we call something a syndrome, is when we've studied a bunch of people who experience it, we find they have a consistent set of reported symptoms. Here are symptoms that tend to cluster together. We find it a lot. We will take that cluster and give it a name so that when we use the name restless leg syndrome, we kind of know the general thing we're talking about. And here we are again with our at least 3 times a week for at least 3 months. A lot of people may have restless leg experiences. Children and teens who are going through growth spurts will have sensations similar to this. That's considered normal part of development. It's when we don't see other reasons for it happening, and it's happening frequently, and it is causing you subjective distress or impairment of function, in this case, your inability to get good, consistent, restful sleep, that we would start to call something a disorder. So you see down there in the 3rd bullet, and again, if you experience this or you know someone who experiences this, they may use different words for it, but creeping, crawling, tingling, burning, itching, vibrating has been used on that. A lot of different words to describe the sensations. It used to be called creepy crawly legs. That's back when we didn't consider it a syndrome. We didn't have enough research support yet to do that. The key, I need to bring this up with the DSM-5, and we really started to hit this hard with the DSM-4. We need some good, collected, peer-reviewed research support before we'll put something new in the book. In fact, the DSM-5 was the first of the DSMs that is actually smaller than the ones that preceded it, because we've merged a bunch of things together. We got rid of some labels that didn't have research support behind them. That's why Asperger's went away and just went under the umbrella of autism spectrum, because that's essentially what it was, high-functioning autism. There's several we've merged together there. As this mentions here in the very last bullet, most sufferers of restless leg syndrome display what's called here periodic leg movements in sleep. And that's where we'll see your legs move or kick around or do something else. Not everyone experiences that. And moving your legs during sleep does not mean you have restless leg syndrome. But of the people who show a lot of leg movement while they're in a sleep state, they seem to be the ones most prone to restless leg syndrome. Again, and moving your legs during sleep is different from waking up and rolling over or stretching your legs, because that's when you actually come out of the sleep state, often because of physical discomfort. So I've gone stage 1, 2, 3, I've come back up 3, 2, 1. I've gone through a REM. If I've been, for example, let's say I sleep on my side and I've been on one side for a long time and my hip's starting to hurt, or my leg's starting to hurt, or my arm. Before I go back down, I will briefly wake up because of that discomfort, and I'll roll over and go back to sleep. It's the same thing if you need to use the restroom in the night. It's during those peaks that you're likely to wake up to go use the restroom during the night there. So you can measure a lot of those things by that cycle. Which brings us to the last one here, substance medication-induced sleep disorder. This is where something you are ingesting is causing your sleep disruption. We're going to see a laundry list of substances that can do this, but right here we're just looking at the DSM-5 criteria. Again, it needs to cause subjective distress, impairment of function, and needs to go on for a certain period of time. We need to have evidence to get this criteria of a disorder, that it is the substance that's causing it. So that means the symptoms needed to have happened right around the time you started the substance or started withdrawing. The 3rd bullet seems stupid, but unfortunately you run into this sometimes a lot, especially with people who want to self-diagnose and they claim that a certain substance is causing their problems, but we have no evidence that the substance they're pointing at has any history of causing sleep problems. The substance must potentially have the potential, use potential twice, of causing the problems. So that 4th bullet also seems stupid, But if the symptoms started before the substance, then yeah, the substance probably isn't what's causing it. So we need to look at a time frame there. Now, if we look at all the categories of sleep disturbance we've gone through today, the insomnias, the REM, the non-REMs, the parasomnias, different medications are likely to cause different problems depending on them. Let's start with alcohol, because this is very similar across all these. I don't have a chart for every substance, but in general, look at the black line there. Over on the left, you've got your stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. On the bottom is your hours of sleep. So we've kind of hit this one before on other graphs. You go down and you come back up. You hit REM. You go back down, you come back up. You hit REM. As the night goes on, you usually spend a little more time in REM and not as much time in stage 3. As a matter of fact, the last half of the night, you may not go into stage 3 at all. You may just go into stage 2. Remember, we noted in physiology, stage 2 overall is the stage where you spend the most time during the night. But look at what happens with alcohol. And this is consistent among all of these. The disruption, even if the substance helps you get to sleep, it is disrupting your normal cycle. It'll shove you down into more deep stage sleep in the beginning, more than is normal, and more REM in the end than what is normal for you. REM rebound basically means you are jumping up into higher levels of REM, closer to consciousness, and staying in it a lot longer than you normally would during sleep. So it disrupts the cycle. And again, when we talk about these substances, we're talking pretty solid ingestion of these substances. It's not like if you have a glass of wine before bed, you've just screwed your entire sleep cycle. If you get intoxicated before bed, you're likely to disrupt your sleep cycle. It'll help you fall asleep, but again, it's going to interfere with the possibility of having kind of normal restorative sleep at the end. So all of these, here's a list of the medications that are listed in the DSM as having research support behind them for causing sleep dysfunction. Caffeine is one that a lot of people feel, well, caffeine causes insomnia. A lot of people can fall asleep on caffeine and have very vivid dreams on them, mainly because it does the same kind of interruption where you're going to enter into long REM periods on that. Cannabis, that's one where people, unfortunately, some people take cannabis to an extreme and think it's a miracle drug that solves everything. Cannabis can help you fall asleep, but it has the same disruption of your sleep cycles that alcohol does. The opioids, the sedatives, stimulants, obviously. Tobacco, that's going to vary by individual. Tobacco is most likely to have sleep problems when you're trying to stop smoking. And so that anything that stimulates the central or autonomic nervous system, so some psychoactive drugs can have sleep disorder associated with them. But let's look at the sedatives, hypnotics in here. And there's a difference in terminology. When we say hypnotics, don't think hypnosis. Hypnosis is bunk. Sedatives are meant to relax you. Hypnotics are meant to put you to sleep. So a sleeping pill that's meant to knock you out is a hypnotic, whereas just a tranquilizer or something that's meant to just kind of settle you down, relax you, is a sedative. So you see those two terms fused a lot in a lot of medications that are meant to relax you but can put you to sleep. They'll use both terms on there. But this is the realm of Ambien, which is Zolpidem. And again, Ambien is not the only one that does this, but it's the one that got the most media attention when it did it. So when we say Ambien Fugue, a lot of sleep medications can do this, because what they're meant to do, again, is put you to sleep, and put you to sleep fairly quickly and get you into that cycle. The problem is what we can find on these is an elevated chance of sleepwalking, and sometimes extremely vivid and driven sleepwalking, to the point that you may go get in your car and go drive somewhere, but while you're driving, you kind of go back into a sleep state. So let's say, for example, I'm on Ambien and I come up into a REM cycle. Ambien may allow me to get up and start moving around. Or maybe in a stage 4 sleep, it allows motor control. I am not fully awake. Parts of my brain are still sleeping, but parts are awake and I'm just not quite there. While I'm driving, I may run through another sleep cycle and go completely back asleep while my car is moving. So there have been numerous cases of car accidents from this. Also, when you wake up in these states, especially if it's REM, it's kind of an artificial REM behavior disorder state. You can act out emotionally, sometimes be violent. But I do want to emphasize here, although this got a lot of media attention, these fugues, these states are very rare. They get a lot of attention when they happen, especially when they make the news, but they're not that common. So as it says here, you can have hallucinations, active sleepwalking, sleep driving, amnesic sex behavior, just like what we mentioned earlier. Some people on Ambien get very frisky and can engage in behavior they may not normally engage in. Because again, when you're in that sleep state, one of the things that isn't functioning as well are your frontal lobes, and that's impulse control and decision making. So the aspects of yourself that you would normally hold back in a social environment because, oh, this won't look good, or, you know, I shouldn't do this, that kind of self-behavioral editing that's part of your frontal lobes often isn't awake when you have one of these episodes. So again, not very common, but let's take a look at a couple things here. A news story warning about it, and a reporter who decided to do a driving test on Ambien. Why not?
A prescription of Ambien will now come with a prominent warning slapped on the box. The Food and Drug Administration is requiring labels and patient guides to alert consumers about possible side effects, which doctors have known about for years.
They wake up for some reason during sleep and they exhibit behaviors that one would exhibit during wakefulness, like walking, eating, potentially even driving.
Black box warnings are the FDA's most prominent warning. They will also apply to the popular sleep medications Lunesta and Sonata, alerting patients to the risk for potentially dangerous behaviors.
It may be that some people are genetically prone anyway for these kinds of disorders, and a medication can become an additional trigger.
Dr. Nancy Foldberry-Schaefer is with the Sleep Disorders Center of the Cleveland Clinic. She says the government's warning is an important reminder that medication should not be the only tool for addressing insomnia.
10 to 15% of adults in America have a chronic insomnia disorder, and very often they've been treated with these medications as a first-line therapy. Other treatments, not medicine, but behavioral therapies, work as well, if not better, long-term.
Those therapies include relaxation techniques and creating a better sleep environment. Because while side effects from sleeping pills are rare, doctors say they can lead to serious injury.
Oh, dude, he's gonna kill somebody.
Drinking and driving, it's terrifying. Alcohol has long been a killer on the roads.
Oh! Stop, dog.
Now a new and growing hazard, a substance not easily detected and used by millions every day. Sleeping pills, including Ambien and its generic version, the nation's most popular, with 44 million annual prescriptions. In New Jersey, police arrested this woman who appeared drunk. It wasn't just alcohol. She had popped an Ambien, gone to bed, had no memory of getting behind the wheel.
You hit something with your car. You can barely stand.
In Texas, a woman who had mixed wine with Ambien also ended up unknowingly on the road. A security camera catches the horrific consequences as she runs over a family in their yard, severely injuring an 18-month-old. She got probation. Her lawyers argued she had no intention of driving. She took the sleeping pill, expected to go to sleep. Researchers say it's important to understand how the brain functions when it's on sleeping medication. The results were eye-opening, to say the least. I'm driving a car, and I clearly shouldn't be, weaving in and out of lanes. But don't worry, we weren't putting anyone's life in danger. For our road test, we came to the University of Iowa. to the nation's most advanced driving simulator, where I am the first person to undergo this simulation while under the influence of Ambien.
We can expose people to things like alcohol or drugs and study how they affect people's driving.
Omar Ahmed is the operations director here. This giant simulator is the closest thing to driving a real car. Inside a Chevy Malibu. From the control room, researchers simulate my virtual road and monitor my every move.
We can see the speed of your vehicle. We have cameras pointed at your eyes, and we're tracking the movement of your pupils.
Before I take the sleeping pill, I'm a pretty good driver.
Kind of having fun getting on the highway here.
And I pass a sobriety test with flying colors.
Perfect coordination.
But then,
Big moment to take my sleeping pill.
down the hatch. The pill is designed to work quickly, very quickly. There's a clear warning with Ambien. In fact, all sleeping pills. Go to bed for at least 7 to 8 hours. Do not drive until you feel fully awake. But we know that doesn't always happen. And it's not just sleep driving. Some impaired drivers have admitted taking the medication just 15 minutes before being pulled over. Others, including Carrie Kennedy, say they may have popped the pill by mistake before hitting the road.
We're going to wake her up and ask her to do her first drive. Lisa?
It's just 30 minutes after I've taken the pill. I start swerving immediately.
Lisa's now driving in the passing lane, so this is very dangerous.
She's really stopped blinking. She's really just zoned out.
90 minutes in, the drug's effects are at their peak, and I'm back on the road.
Like totally fell asleep for a second.
I was so drowsy, I swiped a big rig.
No, that was close.
If she was in a real car, this would be the end.
After my disastrous drive, I attempted the sobriety test once more.
That's your eye. No, it wasn't. It was?
And one more attempt in the car, 4 hours after taking my sleeping pill. See that red light? I blew right through it.
You're intoxicated, I can smell.
Remember that New Jersey woman? Attorney Richard Uslan successfully used the first Ambien defense to get her off.
When you're taking these sleep aids, you're playing Russian roulette because you would not necessarily have any indication whatsoever that you can actually sleep drive and be a danger to yourself and others in this instance.
The drug's developer says Ambien has a 20-year track record and is perfectly safe when taken as directed. They point out that sleep driving is very rare and usually the result of taking too much medication or also drinking alcohol.
Please brake to a stop.
But as I clearly found out, it is not a medication to be taken lightly. As soon as the car turned off, I did too.
Yeah, so don't worry about it too much. If you are prone to sleepwalking, be kind of cautious with the medications that put you to sleep. Also, if you become dependent on them, it will disrupt your cycle. They'll help you get to sleep, but they will disrupt your normal pattern and you won't have the same kind of refreshed feeling. And you'll find yourself more and more groggy and kind of more low functional. So they can be something that's kind of just something to help you fall back into a pattern, but no sleep aid is something you should be at the point that you're using every night or most nights a week. You should try to find what else in my environment might be disturbing my ability to sleep. Do I have lights on? Do I sit there in bed on my phone until I feel like going to sleep? Because any screen is stimulating the visual cortex and causing arousal. And you're basically thinking about too much stuff while you're doing that. A lot of the times, part of the problem getting to sleep is you can't stop the thoughts from spinning in your head. This is where you may want to think about putting on music and concentrating on the music as you fall asleep and not letting those thoughts in. If they keep intruding, and they will if you've fallen into a habit of it, kick them to the curb and concentrate on the music again and keep doing that. And you can train your brain to stop that rumination from happening there. So sleep deprivation Let's take a look at a couple clips here. One, a DJ from the 50s who stayed awake for quite a substantial time as a fundraiser, and then another little summary of this.
New York, January 1959. Scene of the most daring sleep deprivation experiment ever attempted. Disc jockey Peter Tripp decided to raise money for charity by staying awake for 200 hours, 8 days and nights. If successful, it was to be the longest period of uninterrupted wakefulness ever recorded.
I don't think anyone thought Peter Tripp was going to stay awake more than 2 or 3 days. Have you ever tried to stay awake before an exam for one night? It kills you. Well, 8 days is impossible.
Oh, pardon me.
In 1953, Jolly West had been a young psychiatrist working at a U.S. Air Force base in Texas. He treated a group of American pilots who'd been captured by Chinese communists in the Korean War. The Chinese had tortured the prisoners by preventing them from sleeping.
I felt that some of the Air Force POWs had not recovered their former personality function after they returned. They told me that they weren't themselves.
On January 20th, 1959, Tripp launched his attempt to break the world record for sleeplessness. To maximize publicity for the March of Dimes charity, he broadcast his show from a studio in the middle of Times Square.
He was a very cheerful, upbeat guy, and that's what we observed at the very beginning. He called himself Mother's little curly-head boy. And away he went.
He would spin his records not 4 hours a day, but 24 hours a day, and he would chatter and answer his phone calls and do the whole disc jockey's shtick.
While New Yorkers listened in their millions, the doctors kept Tripp under constant observation. As the hours mounted, it became harder for them to keep him awake.
When studies of sleep deprivation are done, I always wonder what measures they took to keep the person awake. Because when we studied Peter Tripp, that was our objective, to make absolutely certain that he stayed awake, and we did. I had the graveyard shift. From midnight till 8 o'clock in the morning, I had my eyes focused on that guy, because after 2 or 3 days, you can imagine, he wanted to play games, you know. He'd want me to look out the window at something. Well, he'd catnap a few seconds. We never did do that. We wouldn't let him do this. He would say, now just to go to the bathroom a few minutes, it'll be on. We said, oh, we're going to go to the bathroom with you. Oh, he was mad and incensed, but finally we said, look, if you got the bathroom and sit down, you're going to go to sleep, don't you know? The whole experiment's over. Oh, he said, okay. So as inconvenient and as awkward as it was, we were with this man constantly.
By the third day, Tripp's behavior had begun to change. He was abusing everyone around him, even his barber, who he'd known for years.
Peter began cursing the barber, really being terrible to him and insulting him, and the barber cried. He didn't understand this. He began crying when Peter cursed him.
His mean body temperature progressively declined over this period of time, and the lower it went, the crazier he got.
Tripp had begun to see things that weren't there. He mistook one of the doctors for an undertaker who'd come to bury him. He ran into the street, terrified. At first, the medical team were puzzled by the hallucinations, but then they made a surprising discovery. When we sleep, we enter a period of REM sleep every 90 minutes. It's during this stage that we dream. Tripp's brainwaves showed that although he was awake, the hallucinations were shadowing the 90-minute cycle of dream sleep.
There was a 90-minute cycle of relative confusion and relative clarity that would ebb and flow. during the time that he would, if he were sleeping, have had REM sleep, those were the times he was most likely to hallucinate. It was as though he were having dreams, some of them with even a nightmarish quality, even though he was awake.
He began seeing spiders in his shoes, and he talked about them, was fearful of this. He actually could see these spiders in his shoes. He'd take off his shoes and look inside them and say, those are spiders. See those spiders in there?
If you're seeing and hearing things that aren't there while you're awake, you're mad. If you're asleep, you're normal and having a dream. So it's the question of whether you're awake or asleep that makes the difference. And in his case, since he wasn't allowed to sleep, it's as though his normal dreaming pattern began to show itself.
As the 200-hour goal approached, West and Cornelison became increasingly concerned.
On the very last night, he was so far out of it that we were hard-pressed to keep from calling an end to the whole thing. But by that time, we were ourselves pulling for him to make it to the end. And we thought that, hey, we're psychiatrists and physicians. We'll keep this guy going and on his feet, even though he's crazy as a loon.
After staying awake for 201 hours, Tripp finally went to bed and slept for 24. When he awoke, the delusions had gone.
At first, he felt that he was unaffected, that he was back to normal, perfectly normal again. But his wife didn't think so. And in fact, their marriage started to go bad after that, and they ended up getting divorced.
The man I saw the first morning that he began this, when he was waving at everybody through the class windows and smiling and laughing and joking with us, after the 200 hours had become a changed individual.
Yeah, now this is the thing with him. There is, and we'll see in this next video, they talk about the world record holder of having verified number of days awake of 11. This guy, this DJ, actually had doctors there with him to verify that he did not sleep. They kept their eyes on him all the time. So what we saw at the end is what we saw later on in other studies. And that's why, as a field, we are not allowed to do sleep deprivation studies anymore. They're considered unethical because they do seem to produce permanent personality change, very likely permanent damage to the frontal lobes. Now again, this is if you are actually awake and kept awake for an extended period of time. A lot of people who say, oh, I've been awake for 36 hours straight, if we actually had you wired up, we'd find you haven't been. You took what is called micro naps, where you just have little moments of an absence of consciousness that you weren't even aware that you briefly went out and were asleep. You just think you've been awake the entire time. It's quite different when we observe someone, make sure we don't give them any little quiet time like that or time alone to do that. So this guy definitely had this disrupt his entire life. Let's take a look at another one that talks about sleep deprivation and its effects on brain and body.
Sleep. You can never have enough of it, it seems. In fact, sometimes it literally feels like you aren't getting enough. But what if you stopped sleeping altogether? Strangely, science understands relatively little about why we sleep or how it evolved in the first place. After all, laying unconscious and dormant for hours on end while predators lurk hardly seems advantageous or smart. But we have discovered a few correlations. For example, adults who sleep between 6 to 8 hours a night tend to live longer. Excessive sleep, however, can lead to medical problems including cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Similarly, chronic sleep deprivation has been linked to aspects of cardiovascular disease, obesity, depression, and even brain damage. But what if you stopped sleeping right now? Well, after your first sleepless night, your mesolimbic system becomes stimulated and dopamine runs rampant. And this may actually trigger some extra energy, motivation, positivity, and even sex drive. Sounds appealing, but it's a slippery slope. Your brain slowly begins to shut off the regions responsible for planning and evaluating decisions, leading to more impulsive behavior. Once exhaustion sets in, you'll find yourself with slower reaction times and reduced perceptual and cognitive functions. After a day or two of no sleep, the body loses its ability to properly metabolize glucose, and the immune system stops working as well. In some cases, 3 days of no sleep has led to hallucinations. Care about how you look? Studies have shown a direct correlation between sleep deprivation and a person's perceived beauty. That is to say, sleep-deprived individuals appeared less healthy and less attractive than when they were well rested. The longest scientifically documented case of being awake was 264 hours, or 11 days. And while they did develop problems with concentration, perception, and irritability, the surprising truth is that they suffered no serious long-term health effects. In fact, no individuals under these documented conditions experienced medical, physiological, neurological, or psychiatric problems.
Now, this is the guy we're talking about in this case. Why we got to put a big red flag up on this one? This guy was not observed the entire time he claimed to be awake. And there's been a lot of questions since his record was set, because there are spans of time, sometimes hours, over that 11 days where no one was observing him and no one knew where he was. It's very likely, even if he didn't think he was, that he was kind of getting very brief kind of power naps in there. So that record is really sketchy. Let's go on with the rest of this.
But there are limited studies, and this doesn't mean permanent damage couldn't be inflicted with more time. Sleep deprivation experiments on rats, for example, generally lead to death after about 2 weeks, but scientists aren't totally sure if they're dying from the lack of sleep or from the stress of constantly being woken up. Perhaps we should look at fatal familial insomnia for an answer, a rare genetic disease of the brain which causes progressively worsening insomnia or sleeplessness, leading to hallucinations, dementia, and ultimately death. This disease has only affected around 100 people in the world, but their average survival span was around 18 months. Over time, the lack of sleep becomes worse and the body's organs begin to shut down. So, while lack of sleep won't necessarily kill you quickly, continual sleep deprivation will have a negative effect on your body. Sleep tight, but not too much.
Yeah, so in general, everything that we say sleep does for a restorative state, it will not do if you get sleep deprivation. And this doesn't mean staying up for 3 or 4 days straight. That'll be an accelerated version of it. But if you go chronically over a period of time not getting enough sleep and not letting your body catch up, the very top bullet here, reduced immune system function, because your immune system is something that recharges and does a lot of its work while you're asleep. If your immune system is at a lower level, and you pick up a virus, that virus is more likely to run and make you sick than it would be if you were getting enough sleep. Hormone and neurotransmitter levels dysregulated. So that can be what causes irritability. If you're prone to any sort of mood disorder, it's likely to be exaggerated. Tissue repair is hormone driven during sleep, so that wouldn't work as well. And if you're not getting enough sleep and you don't have the refreshed resource of the brain, you're not going to be as alert when you're awake. You're not going to have the same ability to concentrate. You're also not going to effectively process memory. Because again, memory, arguably the majority of memory processing happens while you're asleep. So if you're not getting enough sleep, you're losing a lot of stuff there. And then another key here, as we saw in the previous section, your brain flushes a lot of toxins out during sleep. So if you're not getting that done, you can cause cell damage, neuron damage, neural death, and again, in sustained sleep deprivation, where you are awake for days without any sort of sleep, you can start to damage neural pathways and have frontal lobe damage as a result. Also, if you are prone, if you have a family history of dementias, sleep deprivation can be a big risk factor for that. Got another little graphic here that just shows all the different things. We're not going to hit these in detail because we've already hit a bunch of them. Things that can go on with sleep deprivation. So all of that going on. One last thing though on sleep deprivation, because it's so damaging, because it can be emotionally taxing and cause subjective distress and obviously impairment of function. Sleep deprivation has been used as torture in the past on people. Physically causing them to stay awake and never let them sleep can produce emotional suffering. In short term, keeping you awake longer than you normally would, it can be used for manipulation, because if I keep you awake past your normal sleep time, the longer you're awake, the more suggestible your brain becomes and the more easy you are to manipulate. There are a lot of little weekend retreats and things that try to stick things in your head and get you to get on board with them, who one of the first things they will do on day one is they may limit your calorie intake and they will keep you awake too long to get you tired. When you're in a really tired spot, pay attention to the information they start feeding you then that they weren't feeding you earlier when you were in a more consciously aware state, because that's the point that you're going to get manipulation coming in there. Now, sometimes groups will do this not to necessarily manipulate or to deceive you, but this can also be good for kind of group bonding, to bring groups together. Put them through something rough. Or again, a little dinner, keep them up late. You can get a lot of team building that goes on in situations like that. So it's not always manipulative. So sleep deprivation can be used for that. Okay, so we're ready to move on. Oh, we're finally heading toward dreams. See you there.